His name lives in every history book. His face, carved into monuments and stamped onto coins, stands as a symbol of freedom and endurance. But behind that image was a man who didn't just fight to save a nation. He fought to survive his own sorrow. This isn't a story about politics. It's a story of survival, of a man who kept going when the world around him collapsed. Through every loss, every heartbreak, his face became a canvas of sacrifice, carrying the weight of a country's pain. This is the story of the man behind the legend. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a small log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. His family was poor, living in a place where even the basic necessities were hard to come by. Lincoln's early life was far from easy. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a farmer who struggled to make ends meet, and the family's move from Kentucky to southern Indiana, when Lincoln was just a toddler, didn't bring much relief. The land in Indiana was rough, and the family lived in a constant state of hardship, moving frequently as they searched for a better place to live. The Lincolns didn't stay in one place for long. Their search for better land led them to Illinois, where they hoped to find more opportunities. For young Abraham, these moves were more than just a series of relocations. They were moments of instability that would shape him for the rest of his life. Lincoln watched his father struggle, and though Thomas was hardworking, he wasn't always reliable. His inability to manage money meant that Abraham often had to take on more responsibility, and his experiences with poverty taught him that survival depended on resilience. Life in Illinois didn't improve much at first. The land was still tough, and the family had to work long hours just to make a living. But it was here that Lincoln began to learn some of the most important lessons of his life. He realized that hard work wasn't just about physical labor, but about perseverance. It was during this time of constant struggle that Abraham began to understand the value of sticking with something, no matter how difficult it became. As a boy, Lincoln didn't have much in terms of material possessions, but he had something more valuable: his curiosity. He began to crave knowledge. Books became his escape from the harsh realities of frontier life. Even though his schooling was limited, he would walk miles just to borrow a book. This love of learning would later become his greatest tool in life, and it all started in the dirt and isolation of his early years. Throughout these moves and hardships, Lincoln learned the most important lesson of all. No matter where he was or how difficult life became, he had to keep going. His experiences in poverty and struggle gave him a sense of determination that would stay with him throughout his life. These early years, filled with hardship, molded Lincoln into the man who would later become one of the most famous leaders in American history. The greatest loss of Lincoln's early years came when he was just 9 years old. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died of milk sickness, a disease caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten poisonous plants. Losing his mother was a devastating blow to young Lincoln. She had been his source of love and comfort, and her death left a hole in his heart that would never fully heal. After Nancy's death, Lincoln's relationship with his father became strained. Thomas Lincoln, though physically present, was emotionally distant. He wasn't able to provide the emotional support young Abraham needed. As a result, Lincoln often felt completely alone. His father didn't know how to help him cope with the grief, and Abraham found himself dealing with his pain in silence. This emotional neglect left Lincoln isolated, and he turned inward, seeking solace in books and his thoughts. The loneliness that Lincoln experienced during these years was overwhelming. He had few friends, and the harsh life on the frontier didn't offer much opportunity for socializing. The isolation was not just physical, but emotional. There was no one to talk to, no one to understand the pain he was going through. Lincoln learned to rely on himself, and it was in these moments of solitude that he began to form his own ideas about the world. The darkness he felt inside fueled his desire to learn, and in many ways, it was his greatest gift. By the time he reached adulthood, Lincoln had learned how to turn personal pain into a strength, and that strength would serve him as he rose to power. Despite the hardships of his early life, Abraham Lincoln never gave up on his love for learning. Books became his sanctuary, and he devoured every text he could find. With little formal schooling available, Lincoln taught himself everything he could, from basic math to law. His thirst for knowledge was unrelenting, and he spent countless hours reading by candlelight, determined to educate himself. Lincoln's lack of formal education didn't stop him from becoming one of the most well-read men of his time. He taught himself law, reading legal texts, and studying the principles of justice on his own. He wasn't just learning to pass a test. He was learning to shape his mind and his future. By the time he was in his 20s, Lincoln had become a self-taught lawyer, despite having never attended law school. This was a remarkable achievement for someone who had grown up so poor and with such limited resources. Books weren't just an escape for Lincoln. They were a way for him to connect with the world. He read not only for knowledge, but for insight into the human condition. Books like the Bible, Shakespeare's plays, and the works of other great thinkers helped him develop a strong moral compass. Lincoln's readings shaped his views on justice, freedom, and human dignity, and these beliefs would guide him throughout his political career. Lincoln's love of books was also a way for him to develop a sense of self-worth. In a world that had often treated him as invisible, he found power in the written word. Through reading, he realized that he could not only change his own life, but also influence the lives of others. His early years as a self-taught scholar made him a man of great intellect, but more importantly, they made him a man with a deep sense of responsibility to others. It was through self-education that Lincoln began to see the world differently. He learned that education was a tool for change, not just for personal growth, but for societal change. As he continued to study law, he developed a sense of justice that would guide his decisions as a politician and a leader. His self-made scholarship became the foundation of his later political career, where he would fight for the rights of others based on the moral principles he had learned through his readings. Throughout his youth, Lincoln worked hard to support himself and his family. He worked on farms, chopped wood, and performed other manual labor just to survive. The physical toll of this work was immense, but it also taught Lincoln valuable life lessons. He learned that success in life was not just about intellect, but about grit and perseverance. The tough work didn't stop with farm labor. Lincoln often found himself in difficult financial situations, as his family struggled to make ends meet. Despite his intellectual pursuits, he knew that he had to work hard just to survive. The demands of farm life were exhausting, and there were times when it seemed like there was no end to the struggle. But even in the face of hardship, Lincoln never gave up. He believed that hard work would eventually pay off, even if it took time. Lincoln's early years on the frontier gave him a deep understanding of the realities of life. He learned that survival was not guaranteed, and that every day was a fight. These experiences shaped his worldview and made him deeply sympathetic to the struggles of others. The hardships he faced as a young man taught him the value of hard work and the importance of perseverance. They also made him a man of action, someone who didn't just talk about change, but worked tirelessly to achieve it. In addition to physical labor, Lincoln's early years also involved a lot of public speaking. At the age of 23, Lincoln ran for the Illinois state legislature. Although he lost, the experience introduced him to the world of politics and public service. He had a natural ability to connect with people, and his speeches resonated with voters. Even though he didn't win that first election, Lincoln's passion for public service had been ignited. The lessons he learned through hard work and struggle would serve him well in the years to come. Through all the struggles, Lincoln's sense of purpose never wavered. The hardships of frontier life had shaped his character and taught him the value of resilience, hard work, and the belief that anything was possible if one put in the effort. These lessons would serve him well when he faced the even greater challenges of leadership in the years ahead. By the time Lincoln was in his late 20s, he had already gained a reputation as a self-made man. His rise in local Illinois politics was marked by his integrity, his dedication to justice, and his ability to connect with people. Lincoln's reputation for fairness and hard work made him a popular figure in New Salem, Illinois, where he lived for several years. His political career began when he ran for the Illinois state legislature once again, and this time, he won. As a young legislator, Lincoln worked tirelessly to improve his community. He used his position to advocate for improvements in infrastructure, education, and the economy. He was known for his honesty and his ability to speak plainly, qualities that earned him respect even from his political opponents. Lincoln's leadership was not just about politics, it was about character. He believed in the importance of moral leadership, and this belief shaped his decisions as a public figure. He also believed that empathy for others was essential to good leadership. By the time Lincoln became a national figure, he had already demonstrated the qualities that would make him one of the most admired leaders in history. His early years of hardship and struggle had given him a deep sense of moral purpose and a belief in the power of compassionate leadership. These qualities would define his presidency and guide him through the darkest days of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln's entry into the political world was nothing like the polished careers of many of his contemporaries. His rise was a slow, humble process, built from the ground up, forged in the fires of personal struggle and public service. Lincoln's political career began in Illinois, where he was first elected to the Illinois state legislature in 1834. At the time, he had little more than his sharp wit and natural ability to speak to his name. His early years in politics weren't marked by the grandeur or prestige that often accompanies a political career. He didn't come from a wealthy family or a long line of politicians. Instead, Lincoln's political career began as it would continue, with humility, hard work, and a deep connection to the people he served. What truly set Lincoln apart from other politicians of his time was his extraordinary ability to connect with people through humor and storytelling. Lincoln had a gift for laughter that disarmed even the toughest critics. Whether in public speeches or casual conversations, his wit was legendary. He was able to take complex political ideas and break them down with humor and simplicity, drawing people in and winning them over. His stories, often laced with humor, were not just entertaining. They were a way of bringing people together and showing them the depth of his understanding. Lincoln's wit and charm became part of his public persona. As his reputation grew, so did his image as a man who was approachable, genuine, and capable of seeing the humor in even the most difficult situations. His ability to use humor to connect with people was invaluable as a politician, particularly when trying to win over those who might have otherwise opposed him. However, behind this public face was a man carrying a deep internal burden. Despite his humor and the ease with which he made others laugh, Lincoln was no stranger to profound grief and inner conflict. His humor, which had once been a source of comfort, was also a shield, protecting him from the weight of his personal pain. As Lincoln's political career grew, so did his sense of responsibility. By the time he was elected president in 1860, the country was on the brink of civil war, and Lincoln knew the weight of leadership would be heavier than ever. Taking office wasn't something he sought out for personal glory. It was a duty, one that he had reluctantly accepted. The United States was divided, and Lincoln, a man with no experience in executive leadership, was thrust into the most challenging role of his life. He didn't feel prepared, nor was he sure he wanted the responsibility of leading a country through its darkest hours. But his sense of duty, his belief in the Union, and his deep commitment to the principles of freedom pushed him forward. Upon assuming office, Lincoln's internal struggles began to mount. The responsibility of making life or death decisions about the war, slavery, and the future of the nation weighed heavily on him. The lines in his face deepened, his eyes grew tired, and the weight of the presidency began to take a physical toll. It wasn't just the war that weighed on him. It was the enormous responsibility of keeping the country together. Lincoln was a deeply empathetic man, and the suffering of others often caused him pain. He was keenly aware of the impact his decisions had on millions of lives, and the psychological burden of that responsibility only grew with time. The emotional strain was so intense that Lincoln found himself questioning his ability to lead. He wrestled with feelings of guilt and self-doubt, especially when he looked at the growing number of casualties in the Civil War. It was a constant internal battle: duty versus personal desire, responsibility versus self-preservation. Lincoln's reluctance to assume the presidency was rooted in his own fear of failure. He knew that if he failed, the country might not survive. The weight of leadership was something he couldn't avoid, and it was taking its toll on him. But despite the growing pressure, Lincoln refused to back down. He accepted the burden of leadership, not because it was easy, but because he believed in the cause. And with that, the emotional toll deepened, leaving marks on his face that no amount of humor could erase. Lincoln's internal struggles during the Civil War were not just about military strategy or national unity. They were also deeply emotional and moral. Lincoln faced a moral dilemma every day as he made decisions that would affect the lives of millions. The question of slavery, in particular, was one that tortured him. He knew that slavery was wrong, but he also knew that ending it would tear the country apart. This internal battle between his moral beliefs and his duty as president was a constant source of anguish. The decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation was one of the most difficult decisions Lincoln ever made. He knew that freeing the slaves would alienate many of his allies and risk further dividing the nation, but he also knew that it was the right thing to do. Lincoln's compassion for those enslaved and his belief in human dignity drove him to act. Even when the political ramifications were unclear, he could not, in good conscience, allow the war to continue without addressing the issue of slavery. His decision to issue the proclamation was not just a political move. It was an act of moral courage. The man who had once been known for his humor and lightheartedness had now become a somber figure, weighed down by the heavy burden of leadership. His face had become the face of a man who had lost so much, yet continued to fight for a cause that seemed never-ending. The transition from humorist to tortured leader was more than just emotional. It was physical. Lincoln's face told the story of a man who had endured unimaginable pain and sorrow, yet refused to surrender. But even as Lincoln's appearance deteriorated, his internal resolve grew stronger. He knew that he could not let the country fall apart, no matter how great the cost. His personal pain, the deaths of his loved ones, the constant strain of war, and the emotional toll of making life or death decisions all became part of his identity as a leader. The toll of leadership had transformed him, but it had also deepened his sense of duty. The emotional exhaustion he felt did not stop him. It only made him more determined to finish the fight. In the end, Lincoln's transformation was not just about the toll of war. It was about the strength he found in his compassion and his ability to endure. The man who had been broken by grief and guilt emerged as a leader who had the strength to carry the nation through its darkest time. The face that had been shaped by pain became the face of a man who had given everything for his country. By the time Abraham Lincoln entered the White House in 1861, the nation was already divided in ways that seemed impossible to reconcile. Slavery was at the heart of that divide. In the South, it was an economic cornerstone, a centuries-old institution vital to the region's way of life. In the North, abolitionists were growing louder, arguing that slavery was not just a political issue, but a moral blight on the nation's soul. But even within the North, there were debates on how to address the issue. Lincoln entered this charged environment not as a radical, but as a man deeply committed to preserving the Union, even if it meant tolerating slavery in the South. In the early days of his presidency, Lincoln was careful with his words on slavery. His primary concern was saving the Union, which he believed could not survive a civil war. While he was morally opposed to slavery, he initially refrained from taking action that would directly challenge the Southern system, fearing it might alienate the border states and push them into the Confederacy. He had a deep moral aversion to the institution of slavery, but his belief in keeping the country united and his pragmatism often led him to take a more cautious stance. The pressures were immense. To many abolitionists, Lincoln's moderate position felt like indecision, but for Lincoln, it was a strategy aimed at preserving the Union above all else. The split between North and South deepened with each passing year. As the war progressed, the question of slavery became increasingly inseparable from the survival of the Union. Lincoln, although hesitant to act decisively at first, could not escape the reality that the future of the nation depended on confronting slavery head-on. The more he witnessed the devastation wrought by the war, the more Lincoln understood that the nation could not heal unless slavery was abolished. Still, Lincoln was acutely aware of the difficulty of such a decision, both politically and morally. He had to weigh the preservation of the Union against the moral necessity of ending slavery. The complexity of this issue and the deep national divide it created was never far from his mind. As the Civil War dragged on, the South's reliance on slavery for both economic stability and military strength became clear. Lincoln recognized that slavery was not just a moral evil, but a tool that enabled the South to continue the war. With each battle, the stakes became higher, and the issue of slavery was no longer a secondary concern. It was central to the survival of the Union. By mid-1862, Lincoln could no longer avoid the reality that the war would only end with the destruction of slavery. The turning point for Lincoln came in 1862, when the war reached a crucial juncture. The Union had suffered significant defeats, and the Southern states were more entrenched than ever. Despite his reluctance, Lincoln could no longer avoid the question of slavery. The political and military realities were too dire to ignore. Lincoln knew that to defeat the Confederacy and reunite the nation, slavery had to be abolished. But he was also fully aware of the profound consequences of such an action. It would be a decision that would forever change the course of history, both in the United States and beyond. The emotional and moral strain of deciding to take a stand against slavery was immense. Lincoln wrestled with doubt and fear. The decision would not only alienate those in the South who fought to protect slavery, but also risk losing the support of border states that had remained loyal to the Union. Yet, as the war continued to ravage the nation, Lincoln could not ignore the suffering caused by slavery any longer. In private, he reflected deeply on the principles of freedom and equality that the nation was built upon. He could not in good conscience allow a nation founded on liberty to continue to support such an inhumane system. As Lincoln wrestled with these internal conflicts, his relationship with the abolitionists became more complicated. Early in his presidency, he had kept them at arm's length, wary of their radicalism. But as the war dragged on, he began to see their point of view more clearly. Their calls for immediate abolition and their refusal to compromise on the issue of slavery resonated with Lincoln's own growing sense of moral duty. He began to understand that he could not simply preserve the Union at the expense of the nation's soul. The more he interacted with figures like Frederick Douglass, the more his thinking on the issue of slavery evolved. By the summer of 1862, Lincoln knew he had to act. The time for compromise was over. The moral weight of slavery, combined with the practical necessity of undermining the South's economy, pushed him to a decision that would forever define his presidency. The Emancipation Proclamation was not just a political move. It was a moral statement. For Lincoln, it was a personal moment of reckoning. The decision was as much about his own moral growth as it was about the future of the nation. Lincoln's struggle was not just political, it was deeply personal. He faced a profound moral dilemma. How could he preserve the Union without perpetuating the injustice of slavery? In his heart, Lincoln knew that slavery was wrong, but he also feared the consequences of acting too boldly. The question of how to balance the preservation of the Union with the moral imperative to end slavery haunted him daily. Lincoln's empathy for both enslaved people and Union soldiers shaped his decision-making. He saw the suffering of the enslaved and felt an intense moral responsibility to end it. But he also witnessed the immense human cost of the war and knew that his decisions would lead to more deaths, more families torn apart. Lincoln's empathy, however, did not blind him to the complexity of the issue. He understood that abolishing slavery would not automatically unite the country. In fact, it might divide it further. The border states, where slavery still existed, but had not seceded, would likely feel betrayed. Northern Democrats, many of whom had initially supported him, might turn against him. And perhaps most importantly, the South would likely never accept the end of slavery without violent resistance. Lincoln knew that every decision he made would have profound, far-reaching consequences, not just for the war, but for the very fabric of the nation. The burden of war was heavy, but the burden of moral decision-making was even heavier. As Lincoln sat in the White House, alone with his thoughts, he agonized over the fate of the nation. Every day brought new questions. Would the Emancipation Proclamation be enough to turn the tide of the war? Would it alienate the people he needed to support him? Could he morally justify the loss of life that would follow such a bold decision? These questions tortured Lincoln, but he came to the conclusion that he could not stand by and watch slavery continue. The moral cost of inaction was simply too high. For Lincoln, issuing the Emancipation Proclamation was a moral reckoning. It was an acknowledgement that preserving the Union was important, but ending slavery was essential. The decision, while a relief in some ways, came with its own set of new burdens. Lincoln knew that the war would continue, but he also knew that his stand on slavery was the right thing to do, even if it cost him politically and personally. The toll of these decisions weighed on him, but he did what he believed was necessary for the future of the nation. The process of crafting the Emancipation Proclamation was not an easy one. Lincoln agonized over the details, fully understanding the consequences of such a monumental decision. The proclamation would not only change the course of the war, but it would forever alter the relationship between the North and South, as well as the fate of enslaved people in the Confederacy. Lincoln had no illusions about the difficulty of the task ahead. Even as he worked on the document, he knew it would not end slavery overnight. But it was a necessary step toward the abolition of the institution. The public reaction to the proclamation was mixed, as Lincoln expected. Abolitionists and radical Republicans praised him for taking action, but many moderate Republicans, border state leaders, and Southern sympathizers were outraged. Lincoln's decision to free slaves only in Confederate-held territories, rather than the entire country, was a calculated political move designed to avoid alienating the border states. Even so, the decision was controversial and divisive, and many believed it was too little, too late. For Lincoln, the proclamation was a deeply personal sacrifice. He understood that the decision would cost him politically, but he also knew that it was necessary for the moral future of the nation. In the months leading up to the proclamation, Lincoln had received letters from abolitionists urging him to take action. Some threatened to withdraw their support if he did not act decisively. He also faced political pressure from his cabinet, particularly from radical figures like Secretary of State William H. Seward, who believed that abolition was essential to winning the war. Lincoln's own conscience, however, was the most powerful force guiding his decision. The national implications of the proclamation were profound. Not only did it make the abolition of slavery a war goal, but it also shifted the moral direction of the Union. The proclamation transformed the conflict from one focused solely on preserving the Union to one that was also about ending slavery. It gave the Union a moral cause that could galvanize support, both domestically and internationally. The proclamation also paved the way for the passage of the 13th Amendment, which would permanently abolish slavery in the United States. As Lincoln signed the proclamation, the weight of the decision was visible on his face. The man who had entered the White House with a sense of duty and conviction now carried the emotional and political burden of one of the most monumental decisions in American history. His face, once youthful and filled with optimism, now showed the lines of a man who had been marked by grief, war, and the weight of leadership. The immediate impact of the Emancipation Proclamation was felt in many ways. While it did not immediately free all enslaved people, it was a critical first step toward the complete abolition of slavery. As Union troops advanced into Confederate-held territories, they liberated enslaved people, and the proclamation became a symbol of hope for millions. But the true legacy of the Emancipation Proclamation lay in its ability to shift the moral direction of the war and the nation. Lincoln's legacy as the great emancipator was cemented by this decision. He had taken a moral stand that would forever change the nation's trajectory. The proclamation gave the Union a moral cause, and it made clear that the fight was not just about preserving the Union, but about ending an institution that had been a stain on the nation since its founding. Lincoln's decision to issue the proclamation, despite the risks and opposition, was one of the defining moments of his presidency. The proclamation also set the stage for the eventual passage of the 13th Amendment, which would formally end slavery in the United States. Lincoln's moral courage in issuing the proclamation was a turning point in American history, one that would shape the nation's future. It provided a moral framework for the country's Reconstruction and civil rights movements, which would emerge decades later. In the end, Lincoln's sense of satisfaction and grief after the proclamation was a reflection of the cost of freedom. He had taken a bold step in the fight for equality, but the war was far from over, and the emotional toll of leadership continued. As the war dragged on, Lincoln's resolve only grew stronger. The year 1861 was one of profound change and upheaval. The Civil War, triggered by the Confederacy's secession from the Union, was a turning point not only for America, but also for Abraham Lincoln. On April 12th, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, sparking the conflict that would engulf the nation. For Lincoln, this was the moment when his leadership, already in question, was thrown into the fire. No longer could he simply speak of preserving the Union in abstract terms. Now, the war had begun, and the consequences of failure were immediate and dire. As the first shots were fired, the emotional burden on Lincoln was immense. He had already been elected president, but now he was faced with the impossible task of leading a fractured nation through a devastating war. The South's rebellion was a direct challenge to his authority, and Lincoln had no choice but to confront it head-on. The call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion was made quickly, but Lincoln knew that this would be only the beginning of the personal toll he would face. It was no longer a question of politics or policy. It was about the very survival of the country. The emotional impact of the war's outbreak was almost immediate for Lincoln. Despite the enormous political stakes, this was also a deeply personal struggle for him. Lincoln was not just leading a country. He was guiding a fractured nation through its darkest hour. The pressure of making life and death decisions for thousands of soldiers weighed on him heavily. Each loss, each battle, seemed to add a weight to his soul. His resolve to preserve the Union never wavered, but the grief from those losses weighed on him day after day. He wasn't just carrying the fate of a nation, he was carrying the lives of countless men who had enlisted to fight for the cause. By the end of 1861, Lincoln had already witnessed the failure of the Union at the Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the war. The Confederacy had delivered a stunning defeat, and the emotional impact on Lincoln was profound. The loss of over 3,000 men, the disarray of Union forces, and the subsequent retreat from the battlefield shattered any illusions Lincoln might have had about the war being short. His leadership was now tested in the most intense and personal way. He had to remain calm, hopeful, and decisive in the face of overwhelming grief and loss. The start of the war changed Lincoln. The personal weight of war, along with the immense grief he had already faced from his own early life, was compounded by the emotional toll of this new national tragedy. It was no longer just the physical battles on the field that tore at Lincoln's soul. It was the personal impact on his moral fabric. The war pushed him into a new role, one where he would have to reconcile his compassion for the suffering of soldiers with the political necessity of preserving the Union. As the war unfolded, Lincoln's mental health began to deteriorate under the weight of constant decision-making. The battles were relentless, and with each defeat, he felt the pressure intensify. The Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862 was one such painful loss. It was a crushing defeat for the Union Army, and the consequences were severe. Over 12,000 Union soldiers lost their lives in the battle. Lincoln, already stretched thin by the demands of his office, felt a profound sense of personal responsibility for each of those deaths. This battle, like others, placed Lincoln at odds with his military commanders. General George McClellan, whom Lincoln had appointed to lead the Union forces, was slow to act, giving Lincoln even more frustration. McClellan's hesitation during crucial moments only worsened the political situation and undermined Lincoln's confidence in the military leadership. The relationship between the president and his generals became more strained, and Lincoln found himself second-guessing his decisions and struggling to assert control over the military strategy. Despite his own growing sense of doubt, Lincoln remained steadfast in his leadership. He was under constant pressure from Congress, the media, and the military to show results. The war was taking an emotional toll, and Lincoln's increasingly graying hair, haggard face, and drawn features spoke of his sleepless nights and unrelenting anxiety. He was often seen pacing the halls of the White House late into the night, reading dispatches, writing letters, and seeking ways to turn the tide of war. His internal conflict was visible to all who saw him. Every day, Lincoln had to make impossible decisions. Military strategy, political alliances, public morale, all were intertwined, and each decision had enormous consequences. But behind closed doors, Lincoln was privately overwhelmed. His belief in the importance of preserving the Union remained resolute, but the emotional strain of losing men, his men, left deep scars. Each victory felt bittersweet, each defeat a weight that threatened to crush him. The president, seen as a man of strength and resolve, was now a leader who was emotionally and mentally drained by the war. The constant battle with military commanders like McClellan, combined with his growing isolation, further strained Lincoln's mental health. The emotional toll was compounded by a deep fear. What if the war was lost? What if he couldn't lead the country through this crisis? His worries weren't just about his legacy, they were about the survival of the Union. And Lincoln's growing internal collapse was only made worse by the loss of life and his inability to sway his generals' tactics. In the middle of the war, tragedy struck Lincoln in a deeply personal way. In February 1862, his 11-year-old son, Willie, contracted typhoid fever and died within days. Willie's death was a devastating blow to Lincoln, already frail from the pressures of his presidency. To lose a child was a grief no parent should endure, but to lose a child in the midst of war while responsible for the lives of thousands was almost too much for Lincoln to bear. The emotional breakdown following Willie's death was profound. Lincoln withdrew into himself, spending long hours in his room, unable to concentrate on the war. He would go to Willie's room, sit beside the empty bed, and reflect on the death of his son, who had brought him so much joy during the bleak days of the war. The public didn't see the toll this took on Lincoln. The man who stood before them as a strong, determined president was struggling with a loss that cut him to his very core. Willie's death was not just a personal loss. It became a political one, as Lincoln's ability to lead was affected by his grief. The war, with its endless losses, was already weighing heavily on him, and now, with the death of his son, Lincoln faced a personal collapse that would have broken many men. Yet, Lincoln continued to lead. He found solace in his work, and though the grief never truly left him, he channeled that pain into his dedication to the Union cause. The death of Willie deepened Lincoln's compassion, and the emotional toll was evident in his interactions with others. His correspondence with Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, took on a more somber tone as both of them struggled to cope with the loss. Yet, even in his grief, Lincoln continued his work, determined to not let personal tragedy interfere with the fate of the nation. His face, once filled with the light of hope, became more somber, reflecting the weight of both his fatherly sorrow and the nation's suffering. As Lincoln's grief over Willie's death set in, his internal battles became more pronounced. The war seemed endless, and Lincoln found himself unable to escape the emotional and mental strain of his presidency. He became increasingly isolated, emotionally exhausted, and at times depressed. His inner struggles weren't just about his grief over his son's death. They were compounded by the overwhelming responsibility he felt to maintain the Union's survival. Lincoln's mental health was a subject of much concern during this period. His physical appearance became a reflection of his inner turmoil. His face, once youthful and full of energy, became gaunt, deeply wrinkled from sleepless nights and constant stress. He found it hard to keep the weight of the war from collapsing his spirit. He had moments of doubt, wondering if he could ever bring the war to an end, whether he would lose his ability to lead, or if the Union would survive. His fear of failure became a constant companion. The fear that he might not be able to handle the war, compounded by his depression and grief, gnawed at him. Lincoln often faced feelings of insecurity and self-doubt, wondering if he was capable of bearing the immense responsibility that rested on his shoulders. His obsession with winning the war took a toll on him, leaving him mentally and physically drained. Yet, even in his moments of deep internal conflict, Lincoln knew that he had no choice but to continue. The emotional exhaustion Lincoln faced didn't stop his leadership. It was a sign of his determination, even in the face of mental collapse. He knew the importance of maintaining morale, not just for the soldiers, but for the people at home. Despite his personal grief and struggle, Lincoln became the symbol of resilience during the war. He led the nation through its darkest days, even when he wasn't sure how much more he could endure. Despite the emotional collapse he experienced, Lincoln's refusal to give up became a hallmark of his leadership. He kept going, even when everything within him screamed for rest, for relief. The war was far from over, and the battles raged on, but Lincoln's leadership never faltered. Each day brought new sacrifices, both personal and political. But Lincoln remained committed to the cause of preserving the Union. Lincoln's resilience was not just a product of duty, it was born from his personal suffering. The loss of his son, his internal struggles, the relentless pressure of war, these things hardened him. But they also made him more compassionate, more determined to finish what he had started. His personal sacrifices were mirrored in his public actions. Lincoln spent sleepless nights drafting speeches, meeting with generals, and making decisions that would forever change the course of history. As the war continued, the toll on Lincoln's body and mind became increasingly visible. His face, once youthful and optimistic, showed the marks of a man who had borne the burden of leadership for far too long. The grief and mental exhaustion were evident in his features, but his resolve remained unbroken. He had given everything for the cause. He had lost family, health, and peace of mind, but he never stopped. Lincoln's face, marked by the emotional and physical toll of war, became the symbol of sacrifice. As the war continued, Lincoln remained focused on his ultimate goal, preserving the Union. His resilience, despite unimaginable loss, became his greatest strength. The country, like Lincoln, was battered, bruised, and exhausted. But through his leadership, there was a glimmer of hope that victory might one day come. The night of April 14th, 1865, began like any other for Abraham Lincoln. Burdened by the weight of the nation, yet seemingly momentarily relieved by the progress the country had made toward healing. The Civil War, which had torn the Union apart for 4 long years, was finally nearing its end. General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant just days before. signaling the collapse of the Confederacy. The country, though scarred and battered, was on the verge of peace. Lincoln could almost feel the weight of the burden lifting off his shoulders. Yet, as he attended Ford's Theater that evening to watch the play, Our American Cousin, the shadow of fate hung over him like a silent predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. Lincoln, ever the dedicated public servant, had spent his days dealing with the political intricacies of Reconstruction, trying to rebuild a nation torn asunder. Despite the relief of the war ending, his mind was still preoccupied with the difficult work of healing the nation's wounds and integrating the southern states back into the Union. His health had been visibly affected by the pressure, and those closest to him noted that he had begun to show signs of physical and emotional exhaustion. But in the final days of his presidency, there was a sense of partial relief. The war was almost over, and Lincoln's dream of reunification seemed within reach. That night, as he sat in the presidential box at Ford's Theater, Lincoln was, in many ways, at peace. It was a rare moment of reprieve, and he shared it with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and two guests, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. The laughter from the audience and the hum of the play filled the air, but Lincoln, weary from years of burden, was able to briefly escape the reality of his role. Little did he know, his final moments on Earth were unfolding. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer enraged by the defeat of the South, had been plotting the assassination of Lincoln for weeks. On that fateful night, as Lincoln watched the play, Booth stealthily made his way to the president's box, and at 10:15 p.m., with a single gunshot, Lincoln was struck. The scene was chaotic. A struggle ensued as Booth fled the scene, and Rathbone attempted to stop him, but the assassin escaped into the night, leaving behind an indelible mark on the nation's history. The nation, in that moment, held its breath. Lincoln was carried from the theater, unconscious and gravely wounded, to the Peterson house across the street. His body, battered by the violence of the assassination, would never fully recover. He lingered for several hours, slipping in and out of consciousness, until his death at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. The weight of a presidency, marked by war and sacrifice, came to a tragic and sudden end in the quiet of that Washington night. The immediate reaction to Lincoln's assassination was one of shock and disbelief. Within moments of the assassination, news spread throughout the Capitol, and soon across the nation. Citizens of the Union, both North and South, were paralyzed with grief. For Lincoln's supporters, his death represented not just the loss of a president, but the loss of hope. Hope for a unified nation, hope for the peaceful reconstruction of the South, and hope that the ideals of freedom and justice would continue to guide the United States. In the South, the reaction was similarly mixed. Some saw Lincoln as the architect of the war, the man who had dismantled their way of life, and his death marked a twisted form of justice for their suffering. Yet, there were also many Southerners who, having endured the ravages of the war, recognized that Lincoln had been a man of compassion and vision for peace. The assassination stunned both sides of the nation's deeply divided political spectrum, and Lincoln's death left a void that many feared might be impossible to fill. Across the country, cities came to a standstill. People mourned openly, weeping for a man who, in their eyes, had come to embody the soul of the Union. For many, Lincoln's assassination became symbolic of the broader tragedy the country had endured. Just as the war had torn the nation apart, so too did his death symbolize the deep wounds that still needed healing. His loss was more than a personal tragedy for his family. It felt like the death of the nation's future. As Lincoln's body was transported back to Springfield, Illinois, where he would eventually be laid to rest, his funeral became a national event. People lined the streets to pay their respects as his remains traveled across the country. The mood was somber, and the entire nation seemed to hold its breath, unsure of what would come next. The funeral procession wasn't just a public spectacle. It was an emotional experience for a grieving country. For millions, it was a moment to say goodbye to a man who had shaped the fate of the nation and led it through the most divisive period in American history. But as the nation mourned, a question loomed. Who would fill the shoes of the man who had steered the country through the storm of civil war? Andrew Johnson, the new president, faced an immediate and monumental challenge. Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union during the war, was not a man of Lincoln's stature or vision. His policies for Reconstruction were seen as lenient, and his approach to rebuilding the Southern states led to conflict with Congress. Unlike Lincoln, who had carefully balanced his moral convictions with political pragmatism, Johnson lacked the deep political acumen to unite a divided nation. This disparity between Johnson and Lincoln would become increasingly evident in the years that followed, as Johnson's presidency was marked by tension, conflict, and eventual impeachment. The emotional devastation reached the highest levels of government. Vice President Andrew Johnson, who would succeed Lincoln, inherited a deeply fractured nation. Johnson's immediate concerns were not only with the logistical realities of Lincoln's assassination, but with the political landscape he now had to navigate. A divided Congress, the ongoing war-torn South, and a country still grappling with what it meant to be whole again. Yet, even as the nation grappled with grief, there was a growing realization that Lincoln's death would elevate him to something greater: martyrdom. His sacrifice would forever be tied to the nation's struggle for freedom, and his death would set the stage for a national reckoning with his vision of equality. In death, Lincoln became a symbol far beyond his life. His assassination transformed him from the President of the Union to an eternal martyr for the ideals of freedom, equality, and unity. His death came at a time when the country was attempting to heal from the wounds of war, but Lincoln's sacrifice would forever elevate him to an immortal status. The nation's mourning was not just for the loss of a leader, but for the future that was now uncertain. His death forced the country to reckon with the task he had left unfinished: rebuilding a nation torn apart by war, integrating freed slaves, and ensuring that his vision for a just America lived on. In the wake of Lincoln's assassination, his legacy became the foundation for post-war Reconstruction efforts. Though his life was cut short, Lincoln's moral authority became a guiding light for the nation's future. Leaders, both in the North and South, now had to navigate the complex realities of reconciliation, with Lincoln's example as the beacon. The ideas of freedom and justice that he had fought for would continue to shape America for generations. In the months following his death, monuments and memorials began to be created in his honor. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. would later become a lasting symbol of his legacy, reminding future generations of the ideals he stood for. Statues and portraits of Lincoln began to adorn public spaces, cementing his place as the most revered figure in American history. The shift in public perception was immediate. Lincoln, who had once been a deeply controversial figure, became a symbol of moral clarity. The bitterness that had surrounded his policies began to fade, and what remained was a collective sense of gratitude for a man who, despite tremendous personal loss and political opposition, had carried the nation through its darkest period. The public's grief was profound, and Lincoln's legacy, in death, became more important than his presidency had been in life. For his family, Lincoln's martyrdom was a double-edged sword. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, remained deeply affected by her husband's assassination for the rest of her life. The emotional toll of losing a husband in such a violent and public way added to the personal grief she had endured throughout their marriage. Yet, in some ways, her own grief became intertwined with the nation's. Her loss, like that of the country's, was immense, and it was one that would never fully heal. Though Lincoln did not live to oversee the reconstruction of the South, his vision for reconciliation and rebuilding would continue to shape the policies of the time. Though not in the way he had intended, Lincoln had always believed in a swift and lenient reintegration of the Southern states into the Union. Emphasizing the need for national healing and reconciliation, he had offered amnesty to former Confederate states that pledged allegiance to the Union, and he had been focused on rebuilding the South without inflicting harsh punishments on its people. However, following Lincoln's assassination, Reconstruction became a battle not just for the future of the South, but for the future of the nation's values. Johnson's leniency and his veto of important civil rights legislation created a rift between him and Congress. Radical Republicans who had grown increasingly frustrated with the slow progress of Reconstruction clashed with Johnson over his refusal to enforce civil rights protections for African Americans. In contrast to Lincoln's more moderate approach, the radical Republicans sought to reshape the South completely, passing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which granted freedom, citizenship, and the right to vote to former slaves. Lincoln's death created a vacuum of leadership, and his absence became evident in the bitter battles that followed. The country found itself at odds not just with the issue of the South's reintegration, but with the deep question of how to secure rights for newly freed African Americans. Without Lincoln's steady hand, the tensions between the need for justice and the desire for reconciliation were amplified. While Lincoln did not live to see the long-term effects of the Emancipation Proclamation, his act of freeing the slaves would become the defining moral legacy of his presidency. The proclamation had been a bold and controversial decision, but it set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the permanent abolition of slavery in the United States. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, would officially end slavery in the United States, securing the freedom that Lincoln had fought for, but he would never witness its full impact. However, the end of slavery did not guarantee equality. The struggle for civil rights for African Americans would continue for decades, with challenges that Lincoln could not have foreseen. The Jim Crow laws in the South, black codes, and violent resistance to African American freedom would make it clear that the battle for racial equality was far from over. Yet, Lincoln's role in bringing about the end of slavery could not be erased. His moral courage and decision to make the abolition of slavery central to the Union war effort would forever define his legacy. His death elevated him to an iconic status, and his image would be forever linked to the idea of reconciliation. Across the United States, monuments to Lincoln began to appear. His face carved into the stone of memorials, his name etched into the hearts of a nation that had lost its leader in the most tragic of ways. Statues were erected in public squares, commemorating his vision of a united America. These monuments not only honored Lincoln's life, but also served as a constant reminder of the work still left to be done in securing freedom and equality for all. In the years following Lincoln's assassination, his image became synonymous with hope and justice. The Gettysburg Address, delivered just months before his death, would be remembered as one of the most profound statements of national purpose ever made. It would be taught in schools, repeated in speeches, and become the ideological foundation for a new America, one that would continue to grapple with issues of race, equality, and freedom for generations. While Lincoln's physical absence left a void, his vision for the nation lived on. The North, having won the war, now faced the monumental task of rebuilding the South, reintegrating Confederate states, and addressing the needs of newly freed African Americans. Lincoln's vision of justice, reconciliation, and liberty became the moral compass for leaders in the years to come. His martyrdom made it difficult for anyone to question the righteousness of the Union's cause, and his ideals became the standard against which all future political leaders would be measured. In the aftermath of his death, a nation divided by war found itself mourning the loss of its most revered figure. Lincoln's assassination was a final, devastating blow to a country that had already been through so much. Yet, as the decades passed, his legacy grew stronger, and his vision for a more perfect union began to take shape, even if it took time for that vision to be fully realized.